In the spring of 260 BC, Rome faced annihilation at sea. Carthage ruled the waves with centuries of naval mastery. Rome had no fleet, no sailors, no tradition of ocean warfare. Yet in 60 days, Roman engineers built an entire armada from scratch and changed the course of history. This is the story of impossible ambition, brutal innovation, and the moment Rome learned to conquer not just land, but the god's own domain, the sea. Spring, 260 BC, the coast of Sicily. The Roman Republic stands at the precipice. For 5 centuries, Rome had conquered through discipline, infantry, and the grinding machinery of the legion. The Republic's soldiers were farmers turned warriors, men who knew the weight of a gladius and the rhythm of the testudo formation. They had crushed the Samnites, humbled the Etruscans, and bent the Italian peninsula to their will. But now, for the first time in their history, Rome faced an enemy they could not reach: Carthage. The Punic city-state of North Africa was not merely a rival, it was a maritime empire. For 300 years, Carthaginian triremes had ruled the Mediterranean like wolves among sheep. Their sailors were born on the waves, trained from childhood in the art of ramming, boarding, and outmaneuvering enemy vessels. Their admirals were legends. Their shipyards in Carthage could produce 100 warships in a season, and now, with Sicily as the prize, Carthage had turned its full naval might against Rome. The Romans had no answer. In the early months of the First Punic War, Roman generals watched helplessly as Carthaginian fleets blockaded their supply lines, raided their coastal towns, and ferried reinforcements to Sicilian strongholds with impunity. Roman soldiers, the finest infantry in the known world, stood on the beaches and stared at the horizon, powerless. The sea was a barrier they could not cross, a battlefield they did not understand. The Senate convened an emergency session. The marble halls of the Curia echoed with the voices of old men who had never seen a warship up close. Some argued for retreat, for abandoning Sicily and fortifying the Italian coast. Others demanded negotiation, a peace treaty that would preserve Roman dignity while ceding the island to Carthage. But a third faction, led by the consul Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Asina, proposed something unthinkable: build a fleet. The room erupted. Senators shouted over one another, their togas flapping as they gestured wildly. Rome had no shipwrights, no naval architects, no tradition of seafaring. The Republic's few merchant vessels were clumsy, slow, and utterly unsuited for war. Carthage had been building warships for centuries. How could Rome, a nation of farmers and foot soldiers, possibly compete? But Scipio was unmoved. He stood at the center of the Senate floor, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Carthage believes the sea belongs to them, he said. They believe we are children, stumbling on the shore while they dance on the waves. Let them believe it. Let them laugh. And when they see our fleet, let them choke on their arrogance. The Senate fell silent. The decision was made. Rome would build a navy, not in a year, not in 6 months, in 60 days. It was madness. It was desperation. And it was the only choice they had. The orders went out immediately. Every carpenter, every blacksmith, every engineer in the Republic was summoned to the coast. Timber was requisitioned from the forests of Calabria and Campania. Iron was stripped from plows and repurposed into nails and fittings. The Senate emptied the treasury, pouring gold into a project that seemed destined to fail. But Rome had one advantage: a wrecked Carthaginian quinquereme, captured intact after running aground during a storm. The ship was hauled onto the beach near Ostia, and Roman engineers swarmed over it like ants on a carcass. They measured every plank, every joint, every curve of the hull. They sketched diagrams in the sand, argued over proportions, and tested materials until their hands bled. The Carthaginian design was elegant, refined by centuries of trial and error. The Romans did not try to improve it. They simply copied it, piece by piece, with the ruthless efficiency of a people who had built an empire on discipline and repetition. Within days, the first Roman quinquereme began to take shape, then another, then 10, then 50. The shipyards roared with activity. Axes bit into timber, hammers rang against iron. The air smelled of sawdust, tar, and sweat. Men worked in shifts, day and night, their faces blackened with soot and their muscles screaming. There were no breaks, no rest. The Republic had declared that the fleet would be ready in 60 days, and failure was not an option. But building the ships was only half the problem. Rome had no sailors. The Senate ordered the construction of wooden training platforms on dry land, full-scale replicas of quinquereme decks. Thousands of men, Farmers, laborers, soldiers were marched to these platforms and taught to row in unison. They sat on benches, gripping wooden oars, and practiced the rhythm of the stroke while officers barked commands. It was absurd. It was humiliating. But it was necessary. The men cursed. They blistered. They bled. But they learned. And on the 60th day the fleet was ready. 120 quinqueremes, built from nothing, crewed by men who had never seen the open sea. The ships were crude, rough-hewn, lacking the grace of Carthaginian vessels. But they floated. And they were armed. The Roman fleet launched from Ostia on a clear spring morning. The oars dipped into the water and the ships moved forward, slow and clumsy at first, then gaining speed. On the shore, crowds gathered to watch. Some cheered, others wept. Many simply stared in disbelief. Rome had done the impossible, but the true test was yet to come. Somewhere across the waves, Carthaginian scouts were watching, and when they saw the Roman fleet, they would carry the news back to their admirals. The Republic had learned to sail. Now it would learn to fight. If you love epic tales of ancient warfare and impossible triumphs, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Let's dive into history together. Summer 260 BC. The Strait of Messina. Rome's fleet prepares for war. The Roman quinqueremes cut through the Mediterranean like blades through silk, their oars rising and falling in unsteady rhythm. The crews were still learning. Every stroke was a battle against inexperience, every turn a gamble. The ships listed in the swells, and more than one sailor vomited over the side, his face green with seasickness. These were not the sons of Poseidon. They were farmers and masons, men who had spent their lives with their feet on solid ground. But they were Romans, and they would learn. On the deck of the flagship, Consul Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Asina stood with his arms crossed, watching the horizon. He was a broad-shouldered man with a face carved by years of command, his eyes hard and calculating. He knew what the Senate whispered behind closed doors. They called this fleet a miracle. They called it a gamble. Some called it a funeral procession. Scipio called it necessity. The Carthaginians had ruled the sea for 3 centuries. Their triremes and quinqueremes were crewed by professionals, men who had been raised on the waves, who could read the wind and the current like a shepherd reads the stars. Their tactics were refined, brutal, and devastatingly effective. They would approach at speed, ram an enemy vessel below the waterline, then circle back to finish the survivors with javelins and arrows. It was a dance of death, and Carthage had perfected every step. Rome had no hope of matching them in skill, so Rome would change the rules. Scipio turned to the man standing beside him, a grizzled engineer named Gaius Duilius. Duilius was not a soldier. He was a builder, a man who thought in angles and leverage, who saw the world as a series of problems waiting to be solved. And he had solved Rome's greatest problem. "Show me," Scipio said. Duilius nodded and gestured toward the bow of the ship. There, rising from the deck like the mast of some strange war machine, was a wooden tower. It stood 12 feet tall, reinforced with iron bands, and at its peak was a long hinged plank. The plank was 24 feet in length, studded with a massive iron spike at its far end. Ropes and pulleys held it upright, ready to be released at a moment's notice. "We call it the Corvus," Duilius said. "The Raven." Scipio studied the device, his eyes narrowing. "Explain." Duilius stepped forward, his hands moving as he spoke. "The Carthaginians will try to ram us. They'll come in fast, strike below the waterline, and pull away before we can respond. But if we can get close enough, we drop the Corvus. The spike drives into their deck, locking the ships together. Then our men cross the plank and board them." Scipio's expression did not change. "You want to turn a naval battle into a land battle?" "Exactly." Duilius grinned, his teeth yellow and crooked. "We can't outsail them, but we can outfight them. Put a Roman legionary on a Carthaginian deck, and the sea doesn't matter anymore. It's just another battlefield." Scipio was silent for a long moment, then he nodded. "How many ships have the Corvus?" "All of them," Duilius said. "Every quinquereme in the fleet." Scipio turned back to the horizon. Somewhere out there, beyond the blue expanse of the Mediterranean, Carthaginian scouts were watching. They had seen the Roman fleet launch from Ostia. They had counted the ships, noted their clumsy movements, and reported back to their admirals. The Carthaginians were laughing. They thought Rome was sending lambs to the slaughter. Let them laugh. The fleet continued south, hugging the coast of Sicily. The island was a patchwork of Greek cities, Carthaginian strongholds, and Roman garrisons, all locked in a brutal struggle for control. The war had been raging for 4 years, and neither side had gained a decisive advantage. But the sea was Carthage's domain, and as long as that remained true, Rome could not win. On the third day of the voyage, the lookout spotted sails on the horizon. "Ships!" he shouted from the crow's nest. "Carthaginian ships, bearing east." The Roman fleet slowed. Officers barked orders, and the crews scrambled to their positions. The corvus devices were checked, the ropes tested, the iron spikes inspected. Soldiers strapped on their armor, gripped their gladii, and waited. Scipio climbed to the bow and raised his hand for silence. The wind tugged at his cloak, and the sun beat down on the deck like a hammer. He looked out at his men, farmers, laborers, boys who had never held a sword until a year ago. They were terrified. He could see it in their eyes, in the way their hands trembled as they gripped their weapons. But they were still standing. "Listen to me," Scipio said, his voice carrying across the deck. "The Carthaginians think we're fools. They think we're children playing at war. They've been sailing these waters since before Rome was a city, and they believe the sea belongs to them." He paused, letting the words sink in. "They're wrong." The men straightened. Some nodded. Others clenched their jaws. "We are Romans," Scipio continued. "We do not retreat. We do not surrender. And we do not lose. The Carthaginians have ships. We have ships. They have sailors. We have soldiers. And when those ships lock together, when that plank drops and our men cross onto their decks, they will learn what every enemy of Rome has learned." He drew his gladius and raised it high. "We are the Republic, and we do not break." The men roared. The sound echoed across the water, a primal, defiant cry that sent seabirds scattering into the sky. Scipio sheathed his blade and turned back to the horizon. The Carthaginian fleet was closing fast. 50 ships, their sails billowing in the wind, their bronze rams glinting in the sunlight. They moved with the grace of predators, cutting through the waves in perfect formation. At their head was a massive kinkarim, its deck crowded with archers and marines. The Carthaginian admiral stood at the bow, his armor polished to a mirror shine, his expression one of amused contempt. He had seen the Roman fleet. He had seen their clumsy rowing, their crude construction, their lack of discipline. This would not be a battle. It would be an execution. The Carthaginian ships surged forward, their rams aimed at the Roman hulls. The distance closed. 500 yards, 300, 100. And then the Romans dropped the corvus. The iron spikes slammed into the Carthaginian decks with a sound like thunder. The planks locked the ships together, and Roman soldiers poured across, their shields raised, their swords flashing. The Carthaginians, caught completely off guard, scrambled to respond. But it was too late. The sea battle had become a land battle, and on land, Rome had no equal. The first Carthaginian ship fell in minutes, then the second, then the third. The Roman legionaries moved with brutal efficiency, cutting down sailors and marines, seizing the decks, and hurling the survivors into the water. The Carthaginian admiral watched in horror as his fleet, the pride of Carthage, was torn apart by an enemy that should not have existed. By the time the sun set, 30 Carthaginian ships had been captured or sunk. The rest fled south, their sails disappearing over the horizon. Rome had won its first naval battle. Scipio stood on the deck of his flagship, his armor splattered with blood, his face grim. Around him his men cheered and embraced, their voices hoarse with exhaustion and triumph. But Scipio did not celebrate. He looked out at the wreckage floating on the water, shattered hulls, broken oars, bodies drifting in the current. This was only the beginning. Late summer, 260 BC. The waters off Mylae. The Republic tastes victory and learns its cost. The news of the battle spread across the Mediterranean like wildfire. In Rome, the Senate erupted in celebration. Senators who had called the fleet a fool's errand now claimed credit for its construction. Priests declared it a sign of divine favor, proof that Jupiter himself smiled upon the Republic. In the Forum, crowds gathered to hear the reports, and when the messengers spoke of the corvus of Roman soldiers crossing planks to board enemy ships, the people roared with pride. But in the shipyards of Ostia, the engineers knew the truth. The corvus had won the battle. It had also nearly sunk half the fleet. Gaius Duilius stood on the dock, watching as the damaged quinqueremes limped back into port. The ships sat low in the water, their hulls battered and leaking, their decks scorched and blood-stained. The corvus devices, those towering wooden structures that had turned the tide of battle, had also made the ships dangerously unstable. The weight of the tower and the iron spike threw off the balance of the vessel, making it sluggish in the water and prone to capsizing in rough seas. During the voyage back to Ostia, 3 ships had gone down in a storm, their crews lost to the waves. Duilius had designed a weapon that could defeat Carthage. He had also designed a weapon that could kill Romans. He turned to the young officer standing beside him, a tribune named Marcus Atilius Regulus. Regulus was lean and sharp-eyed, a man who had risen through the ranks on merit rather than birth. He had fought in the battle at Mylae, had crossed the Corvus onto a Carthaginian deck and killed 2 men with his own hands. Now he stood with his arms crossed, his expression grim. "We can't keep using them," Regulus said. "Not like this." Duilius nodded slowly. "The Senate won't care. They see victory. They see captured ships and dead Carthaginians. They don't see the men who drowned because the Corvus made the ships too heavy." "Then we make them see," Regulus said. "We show them the wrecks. We show them the bodies." Duilius shook his head. "It won't matter. The Senate has tasted blood. They'll want more battles, more victories, and they'll keep sending fleets out with the Corvus no matter how many ships we lose." Regulus was silent for a moment. Then he said, "So we adapt." Duilius looked at him. "How?" "We train the crews better. We reinforce the hulls. We learn to fight in calm seas and avoid storms. The Corvus is a tool, Duilius. A dangerous tool, but it's the only tool we have that works." Duilius stared out at the harbor, at the battered ships and the exhausted sailors. He thought of the men who had drowned, their bodies pulled down by the weight of their armor, their screams swallowed by the waves. He thought of the Carthaginians regrouping in their strongholds, building new fleets, preparing for the next battle. Rome had won, but the war was far from over. In Carthage, the defeat at Mylae sent shockwaves through the ruling council. The suffets, the twin magistrates who governed the city, convened an emergency session in the great hall overlooking the harbor. The room was filled with merchants, admirals, and aristocrats, all shouting over one another, their voices echoing off the marble walls. "How?" one of the suffets demanded, slamming his fist on the table. "How did a nation of farmers defeat our fleet?" The Carthaginian admiral who had survived the battle stood before the council, his face pale and drawn. His name was Hannibal Gisco, and he had commanded Carthaginian fleets for 20 years. He had never lost a battle, until now. "They have a new weapon," Gisco said, his voice hoarse. "A boarding device, a plank with an iron spike. They drop it onto our decks and lock the ships together. Then their soldiers cross and board us." The room fell silent. Then one of the merchants, a fat man with rings on every finger, laughed. "A plank? You're telling us that Rome defeated our navy with a plank?" Gisco's jaw tightened. "It's more than a plank, it's a bridge. It turns a naval battle into an infantry battle, and their infantry is better than ours. Then we avoid them," another admiral said. "We stay at range. We use our speed and maneuverability. We don't let them get close enough to use their device." Gisco shook his head. "They'll adapt. They'll find a way to close the distance. And even if we avoid them, they've already proven they can build a fleet in 60 days, from nothing." The suffet leaned forward, his eyes cold. "Then we destroy them before they can build another one." The council murmured in agreement. Orders were given. New ships would be constructed, new crews would be trained. And the next time Carthage met Rome at sea, there would be no mercy. Back in Rome, the Senate was already planning the next campaign. Consul Scipio had returned to the city in triumph, his toga stained with salt and blood, his name on every tongue. He stood before the Senate and delivered his report, describing the battle in vivid detail, the clash of ships, the roar of the Corvus, the screams of the Carthaginians as Roman soldiers poured onto their decks. The Senate listened in rapt silence. When Scipio finished, they erupted in applause, but one senator, an old man named Appius Claudius Caudex, raised his hand for silence. He was a veteran of the Samnite Wars, a man who had seen more battles than most of the Senate combined. His face was lined with scars and his voice was like gravel. "We have won a battle," Claudius said, "not a war. Carthage has more ships, more gold, more experience. They will rebuild, they will adapt, and they will come for us again." The Senate shifted uncomfortably. Scipio nodded. "Then we must strike first. We take the fight to them. We invade Sicily in force, cut off their supply lines, and force them to fight on our terms." Claudius leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "And what happens when the next storm hits? What happens when the Corvus sinks more of our ships than the Carthaginians do?" Scipio met his gaze. "Then we build more ships, and we train better crews, and we keep fighting until Carthage is broken." The Senate voted. The motion passed. Rome would continue the war. On the coast of Sicily, in a small fishing village near Mylae, A Carthaginian scout crouched in the shadows and watched the Roman fleet anchor in the harbor. He counted the ships, noted their condition, and memorized every detail. Then he slipped away into the night, moving swiftly through the hills toward the Carthaginian stronghold at Panormus. The Romans had won a battle, but Carthage was watching, and Carthage was learning. In the Roman camp, soldiers sat around fires cleaning their weapons and sharing stories of the battle. Some boasted of the men they had killed. Others spoke in hushed tones of the friends they had lost. A young legionary, barely 18, stared into the flames and said nothing. He had crossed the Corvus for the first time that day. He had felt the plank sway beneath his feet, had heard the screams of men falling into the water, had driven his gladius into a Carthaginian sailor's chest, and felt the life drain out of him. He had survived, but he did not feel victorious. An older soldier, a veteran with a scar across his cheek, sat down beside him. "First battle?" The young legionary nodded. "It gets easier," the veteran said. Then he paused. "No, that's a lie. It doesn't get easier. You just get used to it." The young legionary looked at him. "Do you ever stop seeing their faces?" The veteran was silent for a long time. Then he said, "No." They sat together in silence, watching the fire burn. Around them, the camp settled into uneasy sleep. The war was far from over, and the sea, vast and indifferent, stretched out into the darkness. Rome had learned to sail. It had learned to fight. Now it would learn to endure. Autumn, 260 BC, the Tyrrhenian Sea. Rome's ambition meets nature's fury. The Roman fleet set sail from Ostia on a gray morning, the sky heavy with clouds and the wind sharp with the promise of rain. 150 quinqueremes, their decks crowded with soldiers and supplies, their corvus devices lashed upright like the masts of some strange forest. The Senate had ordered an invasion of western Sicily, a bold strike at the heart of Carthaginian territory. If Rome could seize the port city of Lilybaeum, Carthage's main stronghold on the island, the war would shift decisively in the Republic's favor. But first, they had to cross the sea. Marcus Atilius Regulus stood at the bow of his ship, watching the coastline of Italy fade into the mist. He had been promoted to fleet commander after the victory at Mylae, a reward for his courage and tactical insight. He was 32 years old, the son of a minor patrician family, and he had spent his entire adult life in the legions. He understood infantry tactics, siege warfare, and the brutal arithmetic of land combat. But the sea was still a mystery to him. He turned to the ship's pilot, a Greek freedman named Theron who had spent 20 years sailing merchant vessels across the Mediterranean. Theron was a small, wiry man with sun-darkened skin and eyes that never stopped moving, always reading the wind, the waves, the color of the water. "How long to Lilybaeum?" Regulus asked. Theron glanced at the sky, then at the horizon. 3 days, maybe 4, if the weather holds. "And if it doesn't?" Theron's expression darkened. "Then we pray to Poseidon and hope he's in a forgiving mood." Regulus frowned. "We're Romans. We don't pray to Greek gods." Theron smiled, but there was no humor in it. "The sea doesn't care what gods you pray to, Commander. It takes what it wants." The fleet pressed on, the ships moving in a ragged line along the coast. The crews had improved since Mylae, their rowing more synchronized, their maneuvers more confident, but they were still learning, still making mistakes. And the Corvus, that ingenious weapon that had won them their first victory, remained a constant danger. The devices made the ships top-heavy and unstable, and in rough seas they became death traps. On the second day the wind picked up. The waves grew taller, their crests white with foam, and the ships began to pitch and roll. Sailors scrambled to adjust the rigging, while soldiers clung to the railings, their faces green with seasickness. Regulus ordered the fleet to move closer to shore, where the water was calmer, but even there the swells were treacherous. By nightfall, the storm had arrived. It came from the west, a wall of black clouds and howling wind that turned the sea into a churning cauldron. Rain lashed the decks and lightning split the sky, illuminating the fleet in brief, blinding flashes. The ships scattered, each captain fighting to keep his vessel afloat, the carefully maintained formation dissolving into chaos. Regulus stood on the deck of his flagship, soaked to the bone, shouting orders that were swallowed by the wind. The Corvus swayed violently, its ropes straining, and he could hear the wood groaning under the stress. Around him, sailors worked frantically to secure the device, but the ship was rolling so hard that men were thrown from their feet, sliding across the deck or tumbling into the sea. "Cut it loose!" Theron shouted, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Cut the Corvus loose or it'll capsize us." Regulus hesitated. The Corvus was their weapon, their advantage. Without it, they were just another fleet of inexperienced sailors facing the masters of the Mediterranean. But Theron was right. The device was going to kill them. "Do it!" Regulus roared. Sailors hacked at the ropes with axes, and the Corvus toppled forward, crashing into the sea with a massive splash. The ship immediately righted itself, the deck leveling out, and for a moment Regulus felt a surge of relief. Then he looked out at the rest of the fleet and saw the other ships struggling, their Corvus devices still intact, the weight dragging them down. One quinquereme rolled onto its side, its oars snapping like twigs, and disappeared beneath the waves. Then another, then another. By dawn, the storm had passed. The sea was calm, the sky clear, the sun rising over a field of wreckage. Regulus stood at the bow of his ship and counted the survivors. 97 ships. 53 had been lost, along with nearly 10,000 men. The fleet limped back to Sicily, battered and broken. The invasion was postponed. The Senate, furious and humiliated, demanded answers. How could Rome lose more ships to a storm than to the entire Carthaginian navy? But the soldiers and sailors knew the truth. The sea was not an enemy that could be defeated with discipline and courage. It was a force of nature, indifferent and unstoppable. And the Corvus, the weapon that had made them victorious, had also made them vulnerable. In Carthage, the news of the Roman disaster was met with grim satisfaction. The Suefates convened once more, and this time the mood was different. The panic that had followed Mylae had been replaced by cold calculation. "They've lost half their fleet," one of the Suefates said. "This is our chance. We strike now before they can rebuild." Hannibal Gisco, the admiral who had survived Mylae, stood before the council once more. He had spent the past months studying the Roman tactics, analyzing their strengths and weaknesses, preparing for the next encounter. "They'll rebuild," Gisco said. "They always do. But they've learned a lesson. They'll be more cautious now. They'll avoid storms, they'll stay close to shore, and they'll keep using the Corvus. Then we adapt," the Suefate said. "We avoid close combat. We use fire ships. We target their supply lines. We make them bleed." Gisco nodded. "And we wait. Let them exhaust themselves. Let the sea do our work for us. Rome is strong on land, but the sea will break them." The council agreed. New orders were issued. Carthaginian fleets would harass Roman supply convoys, raid coastal settlements, and avoid direct engagement whenever possible. It was a strategy of attrition designed to wear down the Republic's resources and morale. But Carthage underestimated one thing: Roman stubbornness. In Rome, the Senate convened once more. The loss of 53 ships had been a blow, but it had not broken the Republic's resolve. If anything, it had hardened it. The senators who had celebrated after Mylae now spoke with grim determination. "We rebuild," Consul Scipio said. "We build 100 new ships, 200, whatever it takes." Appius Claudius Caudex, the old veteran, shook his head. "We can't keep throwing fleets into the sea and hoping for the best. We need better ships, better training, better tactics. Then we improve," Scipio said. "We learn from our mistakes. We adapt. That's what Rome does." The Senate voted. The motion passed. Construction began immediately, but this time the engineers made changes. The Corvus devices were redesigned, made lighter and more stable. The hulls were reinforced. The crews were trained not just to row, but to read the weather, to recognize the signs of an approaching storm, to know when to seek shelter and when to press on. Rome was learning, slowly, painfully at the cost of thousands of lives, but it was learning. On the coast of Sicily, in the ruins of a small fishing village destroyed by Carthaginian raiders, a Roman centurion stood among the ashes and stared out at the sea. His name was Lucius Valerius, and he had lost his brother in the storm. He had watched the ship capsize, had heard his brother's screams as he was dragged down by the weight of his armor, had been powerless to save him. Now he stood alone, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. "We'll make them pay," he whispered to the wind. "Every last one of them." The sea did not answer. It never did. But somewhere, far across the water, Carthage was waiting, and Rome was coming. Winter, 259 BC. The coast of North Africa. Rome takes the war to Carthage's doorstep. The new fleet launched in the spring of 259 BC. 180 quinqueremes, their hulls reinforced, their Corvus devices redesigned and balanced. The crews were better trained, the officers more experienced, and the Republic's determination had hardened into something cold and unyielding. The Senate had made a decision that shocked even Rome's allies. They would not simply fight for Sicily. They would invade Africa itself. It was audacious, It was reckless. It was exactly the kind of gamble that had built the Republic. Marcus Atilius Regulus stood on the deck of his flagship as the fleet crossed the Mediterranean, the African coast a dark line on the horizon. He had been given command of the invasion force, 15,000 legionaries and a mandate from the Senate, bring Carthage to its knees. The soldiers were quiet as the ships approached the shore. Many had never left Italy before. They had heard stories of Africa, of deserts that stretched to the edge of the world, of cities built on gold, of warriors who rode elephants into battle. Now they would see it for themselves. The fleet landed at Cape Bon, a rocky promontory 60 miles east of Carthage. The legionaries disembarked in good order, forming ranks on the beach while the ships anchored offshore. Regulus stood at the water's edge and looked inland. The land was dry and brown, dotted with olive groves and small farms. In the distance, smoke rose from a village. "Secure the beachhead," Regulus ordered. "Then we march." The Roman army moved inland like a machine, disciplined and relentless. They burned the farms, seized the grain stores, and drove the inhabitants before them. It was not cruelty for its own sake. It was strategy. Every farm destroyed was food denied to Carthage. Every village razed was a message. Rome had come, and it would not leave until Carthage was broken. The Carthaginian response was swift. Within days, an army appeared on the horizon, 20,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry, led by a general named Hasdrubal. He was a veteran of the Sicilian campaigns, a man who had fought Romans before and knew their tactics. He deployed his forces on a ridge overlooking the Roman camp, his cavalry on the flanks, his infantry in the center. Regulus studied the Carthaginian position from the valley below. The ridge gave Hasdrubal the high ground, a significant advantage, but Regulus had fought on worse terrain. He turned to his officers. "We attack at dawn. Full frontal assault. No tricks, no maneuvers. We hit them hard and we don't stop." One of the tribunes, a young man named Gaius Sulpicius, frowned. "They have the high ground, Commander, and their cavalry outnumbers ours. Then we'll break their infantry before their cavalry can flank us," Regulus said. "The legion is built for this. Trust the formation, trust the men." The officers nodded, though some looked uneasy. They had seen what Roman discipline could do on flat ground, in open fields where the testudo and the gladius reigned supreme. But this was different. This was Africa, and the enemy was not some barbarian tribe. This was Carthage. The battle began at first light. The Roman legionaries advanced up the ridge in tight formation, their shields locked, their javelins ready. The Carthaginians met them with a hail of arrows and sling stones, but the Romans pressed on, their shields absorbing the impacts, their lines unbroken. When the two armies collided, the sound was like thunder. Shields crashed against shields, swords bit into flesh, and men screamed and died in the dust. The Carthaginian infantry fought hard, but they were not legionaries. They lacked the discipline, the training, the brutal efficiency of Rome's war machine. Slowly, step by step, the Romans pushed them back. Then the Carthaginian cavalry charged. They came from both flanks, 3,000 horsemen thundering down the slopes, their lances lowered, their war cries echoing across the battlefield. The Roman cavalry, outnumbered and outmatched, broke and fled. The Carthaginian riders swept around the Roman flanks, cutting down stragglers and threatening to encircle the entire legion. But Regulus had anticipated this. He had held back 2 cohorts in reserve, positioned at the rear of the formation. As the Carthaginian cavalry closed in, he ordered the cohorts to wheel and form a defensive square. The legionaries locked their shields and braced their spears, creating a wall of iron and wood. The Carthaginian cavalry crashed into the square and recoiled. Horses screamed and reared as they impaled themselves on Roman spears. Riders were dragged from their saddles and cut down. The charge faltered, then broke. At the same moment, the Roman center shattered the Carthaginian infantry. Hasdrubal's line collapsed and his soldiers fled in disarray, streaming down the ridge and into the desert. The Carthaginian general tried to rally them, but it was too late. The battle was over. Regulus stood among the dead, his armor splattered with blood, his gladius still in his hand. Around him, Roman soldiers cheered and embraced, their voices hoarse with exhaustion and triumph. They had won. They had defeated a Carthaginian army on African soil. But Regulus did not celebrate. He looked out at the fleeing enemy, at the bodies scattered across the ridge, and he thought of the long road ahead. This was one battle. Carthage had more armies, more generals, more resources, and they were fighting on their own land now with their backs to the wall. The war was far from over. The news of the Roman victory sent shockwaves through Carthage. The city, which had seemed invincible behind its walls and its fleets, now faced an existential threat. Roman soldiers were camped less than a day's march from the capital. Roman ships controlled the sea, and the Republic showed no signs of stopping. The Suffetes convened an emergency session. The Great Hall was filled with shouting, accusations, and panic. Some called for peace negotiations. Others demanded that every able-bodied man in the city be armed and sent to fight. A few suggested abandoning Carthage entirely and retreating to the interior, but one voice cut through the chaos. It belonged to a man who had been sitting silently in the corner, watching the council tear itself apart. His name was Xanthippus, and he was a Spartan mercenary, a veteran of the wars in Greece, a man who had spent his life studying the art of war. "You're losing because you're fighting like Romans," Xanthippus said. The room fell silent. The Suffetes turned to look at him. "Explain," one of them said. Xanthippus stood and walked to the center of the hall. "The Romans are infantry. They fight in tight formations, with discipline and endurance. You've been trying to match them and you can't, but you have something they don't." "What?" the Suffete demanded. "Elephants," the council murmured. Carthage had war elephants, massive beasts imported from the interior of Africa, trained to charge into enemy lines and break formations. But they had rarely been used effectively. The animals were unpredictable, difficult to control, and expensive to maintain. "The Romans have never faced elephants in open battle," Xanthippus continued. "Their horses will panic, their formations will break, and when they break, your cavalry can finish them." The Suffete leaned forward. "And if the elephants fail?" Xanthippus smiled. "Then you die. But you're going to die anyway if you keep fighting the way you have been." The council voted. Xanthippus was given command of the Carthaginian army. He had one chance to save the city. In the Roman camp, Regulus received reports of the new Carthaginian commander, a Spartan mercenary, a man who had fought in Greece, who understood tactics and strategy in a way that most Carthaginian generals did not. Regulus was not worried. He had defeated every enemy Rome had ever faced. He had crossed the sea, invaded Africa, and won a decisive victory. One more battle, and Carthage would fall. He did not know that he was about to face the greatest challenge of his life. The two armies met on the plains outside Carthage, in a flat, open field where the Carthaginian cavalry and elephants could maneuver freely. Regulus deployed his legionaries in the standard formation, 3 lines deep, with cavalry on the flanks. He had 20,000 men, veterans of Sicily and the African campaign, the finest soldiers in the Republic. Xanthippus deployed his forces differently. He placed the elephants in the front, 100 massive beasts, their tusks tipped with iron, their backs carrying archers and javelin throwers. Behind them, the Carthaginian infantry. On the flanks, 4,000 cavalry. Regulus looked at the elephants and felt a flicker of unease, but he pushed it aside. They were just animals. The legion would break them. He gave the order to advance, and the world exploded into chaos. Spring, 255 BC. The plains outside Carthage. Rome meets its nemesis. The elephants charged. They came forward in a line, 100 beasts moving as one, their footsteps shaking the earth, their trumpeting screams splitting the air. The Roman soldiers had never seen anything like it. These were not horses or chariots. These were mountains of flesh and fury, each one weighing as much as 50 men, their tusks gleaming like spears, their eyes wild with rage. The Roman cavalry broke first. The horses, terrified by the smell and sound of the elephants, reared and bolted, throwing their riders or fleeing in panic. Within moments, the Roman flanks were exposed. The cavalry scattered across the plains like leaves in a storm. But the legionaries held. They were Romans. They did not break. "Hold the line," Regulus roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Shields up, javelins ready." The front ranks raised their shields and braced themselves. The elephants closed the distance. 200 yards. 150. The Romans hurled their javelins, and some found their marks, sinking into the thick hides of the beasts. A few elephants stumbled, wounded and enraged, but most kept coming, and then they hit. The impact was catastrophic. The elephants smashed into the Roman lines like battering rams, their tusks goring soldiers, their feet crushing men beneath their weight. The tight formations that had made Rome invincible shattered like pottery. Legionaries were thrown into the air, trampled or impaled. The archers on the elephants' backs rained arrows down on the chaos below, and the Carthaginian infantry surged forward behind the beasts, exploiting the gaps in the Roman lines. Regulus fought in the center of the maelstrom, his gladius flashing as he cut down Carthaginian soldiers. Around him his men struggled to reform, to find some semblance of order in the madness. But the elephants kept coming, and the Carthaginian cavalry, now unopposed, swept around the flanks and began encircling the Roman army. "Fall back," one of the tribunes shouted. "We have to fall back." But there was nowhere to fall back to. The Carthaginians had them surrounded. The plains had become a killing field. Regulus saw it then, in the eyes of his men, the thing he had never seen before in a Roman soldier. Fear. Not the fear of death, which every soldier carried into battle, but the fear of defeat, the realization that they were going to lose. "Form square," Regulus bellowed. "Form square and hold." The surviving legionaries pulled back into a defensive formation, shields locked, spears outward. It was the last resort, the formation used when all else had failed. The Carthaginians pressed in from all sides, their cavalry charging again and again, their infantry probing for weaknesses. The elephants circled the square, trumpeting and stamping, their handlers urging them forward. The battle raged for hours. The sun climbed high, then began its descent, and still the Romans held. But they were dying. Slowly, inevitably, the square was shrinking, the dead piling up around the survivors. Regulus stood in the center, his armor dented and bloodied, his sword arm numb with exhaustion. He looked around at what remained of his army, 2,000 men, maybe less, out of 20,000. He had led them to their deaths. A Carthaginian officer rode forward under a white flag. He was young, his armor polished, his expression carefully neutral. "The General Xanthippus offers terms," the officer called out in accented Latin. "Surrender now, and your men will be spared. Refuse, and we will kill every last one of you." Regulus stepped forward, his gladius still in his hand. "Rome does not surrender." The officer nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "Then you will die here, all of you." Regulus looked back at his men. They were exhausted, wounded, surrounded. They had fought with courage and discipline, and it had not been enough. The elephants had broken them. The cavalry had encircled them, and now they would be slaughtered. But they were still Romans. "We die standing," Regulus said. The officer turned his horse and rode back to the Carthaginian lines. A moment later the drums began to beat, and the final assault commenced. The Carthaginians came from all sides, a tide of iron and fury. The Roman square collapsed under the weight of the attack, and the battle devolved into a desperate melee. Men fought hand to hand, stabbing and clawing, their screams lost in the roar of combat. Regulus killed 3 men before a spear took him in the leg. He fell to one knee, still swinging his gladius, and then a Carthaginian soldier struck him across the head with a shield. The world went dark. When he woke, he was lying on the ground, his hands bound, his armor stripped away. Around him the battlefield was silent. The Carthaginians were moving among the dead, finishing off the wounded and collecting weapons. Of the 20,000 Romans who had marched onto the plains that morning, fewer than 500 had survived. Regulus had been captured. A shadow fell across him, and he looked up to see Xanthippus standing over him. The Spartan was older than Regulus had expected, his face lined with scars, his eyes cold and calculating. "You fought well," Xanthippus said. "Better than I expected, but you made a mistake." Regulus said nothing. "You thought discipline and courage would be enough," Xanthippus continued. "You thought the legion was invincible, but every weapon has a counter. Every tactic has a weakness. You just had to find an enemy smart enough to exploit it." Regulus spat blood onto the ground. "Carthage is still going to lose this war." Xanthippus smiled. "Perhaps, but you won't live to see it." He turned and walked away, leaving Regulus lying among the dead. The news of the disaster reached Rome 3 weeks later. The Senate convened in stunned silence as the messenger delivered his report. An entire army destroyed. Marcus Attilius Regulus captured. The African invasion, a catastrophic failure. For the first time in the war, Rome tasted despair. Appius Claudius Caudex, the old veteran, stood before the Senate, his face grim. "We underestimated them. We thought we could fight them the way we fight everyone else. We were wrong. Then what do we do?" One of the younger senators demanded. "Do we sue for peace? Do we abandon Sicily?" "No," Claudius said. "We learn. We adapt. We find a way to counter their elephants, their cavalry, their tactics, and we keep fighting." The Senate voted. The war would continue, but the cost was becoming unbearable. Thousands of men dead, hundreds of ships lost, and now, the greatest Roman general of his generation was a prisoner in Carthage. In Carthage, Regulus was thrown into a cell beneath the city, a dark, cramped space that reeked of filth and despair. He was given barely enough food to survive, and his captors made it clear that he would never see Rome again. But Regulus did not break. He sat in the darkness, his mind replaying the battle, analyzing his mistakes, thinking of the men he had led to their deaths. He had failed them. He had failed Rome, but the Republic would endure. It always did. Years later, the Carthaginians would offer to exchange Regulus for Carthaginian prisoners held by Rome. They would send him back to the Republic under a solemn oath. He would negotiate the exchange, then return to Carthage to face his fate. Regulus would stand before the Senate and urge them to refuse the exchange. He would tell them that Rome must never negotiate with its enemies, that the war must be fought to the bitter end no matter the cost. And then, true to his oath, he would return to Carthage. The Carthaginians would torture him to death, but that was still to come. For now, Regulus sat in his cell and waited. The war raged on above him, and the sea, indifferent and eternal, continued to claim its victims. Rome had learned to sail, it had learned to fight, and now in the blood-soaked plains of Africa, it had learned the price of hubris. The Republic would not forget. 256, 249 BC, the Mediterranean. Rome and Carthage bleed each other dry. The war dragged on. For 7 years after the disaster in Africa, Rome and Carthage fought a grinding, brutal conflict that consumed fleets, armies, and entire generations. The initial shock of Regulus's defeat had given way to a grim determination in the Senate. If Rome could not win quickly, it would win slowly. If it could not win through brilliance, it would win through endurance. The Republic rebuilt its fleet, again and again and again. Every time a storm sank a squadron, every time Carthaginian fire ships burned a convoy, every time the sea claimed another 100 lives, Rome built more ships. The forests of Italy were stripped bare to provide timber. The mines of Etruria ran day and night to produce iron. The treasury was emptied, then refilled through taxes and loans, then emptied again. The Roman people bore the cost without complaint. Sons followed fathers into the legions. Widows remarried soldiers. Orphans grew up knowing only war. The Republic had become a machine, and the machine would not stop until Carthage was broken. But Carthage was not breaking. The Punic city had its own reserves of wealth and determination. Its merchant fleet still sailed the Mediterranean, trading with Egypt, Greece, and the Eastern kingdoms. Its silver mines in Iberia poured precious metal into the treasury, and its generals, learning from Xanthippis's victory, had adapted their tactics to counter Roman strengths. The war became a contest of attrition, fought not in grand battles but in 1,000 small skirmishes, ambushes, and raids. Roman fleets hunted Carthaginian convoys. Carthaginian cavalry harassed Roman supply lines. Cities changed hands, were besieged, were relieved, were besieged again, and men died, by the thousands, by the tens of thousands. In 253 BC, a Roman fleet of 150 ships was caught in a storm off the coast of Sicily. 120 ships were lost. 15,000 men drowned. Rome rebuilt. In 251 BC, a Carthaginian army besieged the Roman garrison at Panormus. The Romans sallied out and defeated the Carthaginians in a brutal battle that left the fields outside the city soaked with blood. The Carthaginian general was executed by his own government for the failure. Carthage rebuilt. In 249 BC, a Roman consul named Publius Claudius Pulcher decided to attack the Carthaginian fleet at Drepana. Before the battle, he consulted the sacred chickens. A Roman tradition meant to divine the will of the gods. The chickens refused to eat. A bad omen. Claudius, impatient and arrogant, threw the chickens into the sea and declared, "If they won't eat, let them drink." The battle was a disaster. The Carthaginians destroyed 93 Roman ships. Claudius fled back to Rome in disgrace, was tried for impiety, and fined so heavily that his family was ruined. But Rome did not stop. It could not stop. To stop was to admit defeat, and Rome did not know how to lose. The Senate convened in the winter of 248 BC, and the mood was darker than it had ever been. The war had been raging for 17 years. An entire generation had grown up knowing nothing but conflict. The treasury was nearly empty. The forests were depleted. The people were exhausted. Appius Claudius Caudex, now an old man, his body bent with age and his voice hoarse, stood before the Senate one last time. "We are bleeding," he said. "Carthage is bleeding. The question is not who is stronger. The question is who can bleed longer. The Senate was silent. We have lost fleets, Claudius continued. We have lost armies. We have lost sons and fathers and brothers. But we have not lost the war, because we are still here. We are still fighting. And as long as Rome stands, Carthage cannot win. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the chamber. But we cannot win this way. We cannot keep throwing fleets into the sea and hoping the gods will favor us. We need one final effort, one last gamble. We build a fleet the largest we have ever built, and we use it to break Carthage's control of the sea once and for all. A younger senator, a man named Gaius Lutatius Catulus, stood. The treasury is empty, Claudius. We have no money to build a fleet. Claudius smiled, though there was no joy in it. Then we ask the people. We ask the patricians, the equestrians, the merchants. We ask them to fund the fleet themselves as a loan to the Republic. And when we win, we repay them from the spoils of war. The Senate murmured. It was unprecedented. The Republic had never asked its citizens to fund a war directly. But these were desperate times. The motion was put to a vote. It passed. Within weeks, the wealthiest families in Rome began contributing. Some gave gold. Others gave ships. A few gave both. It was not charity. It was an investment. If Rome won, they would be repaid with interest. If Rome lost, the money would not matter anyway. By the spring of 242 BC, the fleet was ready. 200 quinqueremes, the largest armada Rome had ever assembled. The ships were sleeker than their predecessors, faster and more maneuverable. The corvus had been abandoned. Too many ships had been lost to storms because of the device's weight. Instead, the Romans had learned to fight like sailors, using ramming and boarding tactics that relied on skill rather than brute force. The fleet was placed under the command of Gaius Lutatius Catulus, the senator who had questioned the funding. He was not a career soldier, but he was competent, cautious, and determined not to repeat the mistakes of his predecessors. Catulus sailed west, toward the Aegates Islands, a cluster of rocky outcrops off the western coast of Sicily. Intelligence reports indicated that a Carthaginian fleet was en route to resupply the besieged garrison at Lilybaeum. If Catulus could intercept them, he could cut off Carthage's last major stronghold on the island. The two fleets met on a gray morning in March, the sea choppy and the wind cold. The Carthaginian fleet numbered 170 ships, heavily laden with supplies and reinforcements. They were not prepared for battle. Catulus was. The Roman fleet struck at dawn, their ships cutting through the water like knives. The Carthaginians, caught off guard, tried to form a defensive line, but it was too late. The Romans rammed their ships, boarded them, and overwhelmed their crews with brutal efficiency. The battle lasted less than 2 hours. 50 Carthaginian ships were sunk, 70 were captured. The rest fled south, their sails disappearing over the horizon. Carthage had lost its fleet, and with it, the war. The news reached Carthage within days. The Sufates convened, but there was no debate, no shouting, no panic. There was only silence. The city was exhausted, its treasury was empty, its armies were scattered, and now its fleet, the backbone of its power, was gone. A delegation was sent to Rome to negotiate peace. The terms were harsh. Carthage would abandon Sicily entirely, ceding the island to Rome. It would pay a massive indemnity, 3,200 talents of silver, to be delivered over 10 years. It would surrender all prisoners of war, and it would agree never to wage war against Rome's allies without Roman permission. The Carthaginian delegation accepted. They had no choice. In Rome, the Senate erupted in celebration. The war was over. After 23 years, after countless battles, after the loss of hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of lives, Rome had won. But the victory was bittersweet. The Republic had been bled white. Its forests were gone. Its treasury was empty. Its people were exhausted. And the scars of the war would take generations to heal. Gaius Lutatius Catulus returned to Rome in triumph, but he did not celebrate. He stood before the Senate and delivered his report in a quiet, measured voice. "We have won," he said, "but we have paid a terrible price. And Carthage, though defeated, is not destroyed. They will rebuild. They will remember. And one day they will come for us again." The Senate dismissed his warning. The war was over. Rome had won. That was all that mattered. But Catulus was right. In Carthage, a young boy watched as the Roman delegation departed, their ships disappearing over the horizon. His name was Hannibal, and he was the son of Hamilcar Barca, one of Carthage's greatest generals. Hamilcar knelt beside his son and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Do you see them?" Hamilcar asked, his voice low and cold. Hannibal nodded. "They have taken everything from us," Hamilcar said. "Our fleet, our island, our pride, but they have not taken our will. One day, you will make them pay for what they have done. Swear it." Hannibal looked up at his father, his young face hard with determination. "I swear it," he said, and the seeds of the Second Punic War were planted. 241 BC, Rome. The Republic stands victorious and forever changed. The triumph was held on a sweltering summer day, the streets of Rome packed with crowds that stretched from the Forum to the Campus Martius. Gaius Lutatius Catulus rode at the head of the procession, his chariot pulled by white horses, his face painted red in the tradition of conquering generals. Behind him marched the survivors of the fleet, their armor polished, their heads high, though many limped from old wounds and their eyes carried the weight of too many lost comrades. The people cheered. They threw flowers and shouted the names of the victors. Children climbed onto their fathers' shoulders to catch a glimpse of the captured Carthaginian ships being paraded through the streets, their hulls scarred and their sails torn. It was a spectacle of power, a declaration that Rome had conquered not just land but the sea itself. But those who had fought knew the truth. This was not a triumph. It was a funeral procession for the thousands who would never return. In the Senate, the mood was more subdued. The war had cost the Republic nearly 700 ships and over 100,000 lives. The treasury was empty, the forests stripped, the people exhausted. Sicily was now a Roman province, the first territory outside the Italian peninsula to fall under the Republic's control. It was a new kind of empire, and no one was quite sure what it meant. Appius Claudius Caudex, now in his final years, stood before the Senate one last time. His voice was weak, his body frail, but his words carried the weight of a lifetime spent in service to Rome. "We have won a war," he said, "but we have lost something in the process. We were a republic of farmers and soldiers, men who fought for their land and their families. Now we are something else. We are a nation that builds fleets in 60 days, a nation that invades foreign continents, a nation that does not stop no matter the cost." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the chamber. Carthage believed the sea belonged to them. They believed we were children stumbling on the shore. They were wrong, but in proving them wrong, we have become something we were not. We have become a people who will sacrifice everything, our forests, our gold, our sons, to win, and we will keep winning, because we do not know how to stop. The Senate was silent. "The question," Claudius continued, "is whether that is a strength or a curse." He sat down, and the chamber remained quiet for a long moment. Then the consul rose and called for a vote on the peace treaty. It passed unanimously. The war was over, but the Republic had been transformed. In the years that followed, Rome absorbed the lessons of the First Punic War with the same ruthless efficiency it had applied to building the fleet. The corvus was studied, refined, and eventually abandoned in favor of more sophisticated naval tactics. The shipyards at Ostia were expanded and made permanent. A new class of Roman citizens emerged, the publicani, contractors, and merchants who had funded the final fleet and now expected repayment and influence. Sicily became a testing ground for Roman administration. Governors were appointed, taxes levied, and the island's grain production redirected to feed the growing population of Rome. It was the beginning of a system that would one day stretch from Britannia to Egypt, from Iberia to Syria, but the cost lingered. The families who had lost sons and fathers did not forget. The veterans who returned with missing limbs and haunted eyes did not forget. And the Republic itself, once a collection of city-states bound by common culture and mutual defense, had become something larger and more dangerous. Rome had learned that it could build an empire, and once that lesson was learned, it could not be unlearned. Across the sea in Carthage, the defeat was a wound that would never fully heal. The city paid its indemnity, year after year, the silver flowing out of its treasury and into Rome's coffers. The loss of Sicily was a humiliation, a constant reminder that Carthage, once the master of the Mediterranean, had been bested by a nation of farmers who had never seen a warship before the war began. But Carthage did not forget, and it did not forgive. Hamilcar Barca, the general who had fought Rome to a standstill in Sicily, took his family to Iberia and began building a new power base. He conquered tribes, seized silver mines, and trained a new generation of soldiers, and he taught his son, Hannibal, to hate Rome with a cold, burning intensity that would one day reshape the world. The First Punic War had ended, but the rivalry between Rome and Carthage had only just begun. In a small coastal village near Ostia, an old sailor sat on the beach and watched the waves. His name was Theron, the Greek freedman who had piloted one of the first Roman quinqueremes. He had survived the storm that had claimed 53 ships. He had survived the battle at Mylae. He had survived the entire war. Now he was old, his hands gnarled with arthritis, his eyes clouded with age, but he still came to the beach every day, drawn by some instinct he could not name. A young boy approached him, curious. "Were you really there?" the boy asked. "When Rome built the fleet?" Theron nodded slowly. "What was it like?" Theron was silent for a long moment, staring out at the sea. "It was impossible," he said finally. "And we did it anyway." The boy frowned. "But you won, didn't you? You beat Carthage." Theron smiled, but there was sadness in it. "We won. But the sea doesn't care who wins. It takes what it wants. And it took more from us than Carthage ever did." The boy didn't understand. He thanked the old sailor and ran off, back to his friends, back to his games. Theron watched him go, then turned back to the water. The sea was calm today, its surface glittering in the sunlight. But Theron knew better. He had seen it rage. He had seen it swallow ships whole, had heard the screams of men dragged down by the weight of their armor, had watched the waves close over them as if they had never existed. Rome had conquered the sea, but the sea had never been conquered. It had simply allowed Rome to survive, and one day, it would claim its due. In the Forum, a monument was erected to commemorate the victory. It was a column of marble, inscribed with the names of the battles and the generals who had led them. At its base, a bronze plaque bore a simple inscription. "In the year 241 BC, Rome defeated Carthage and claimed dominion over the sea. Let all who read this know, the Republic does not yield, the Republic does not break, and the Republic will endure." The people of Rome read the inscription and believed it. They believed that their victory was inevitable, that their Republic was invincible, that the gods themselves had blessed their cause. But history would remember the truth. Rome had not won because it was destined to win. It had won because it had been willing to pay a price that no other nation would pay. It had sacrificed its forests, its gold, its sons. It had built fleets in 60 days and sent them into storms. It had invaded Africa and lost an army. It had bled itself white again and again, until Carthage could bleed no more. And in that sacrifice, Rome had discovered something about itself. It had discovered that it would do anything to win, that it would endure any cost, suffer any loss, commit any atrocity if it meant victory. That discovery would carry the Republic to heights of power and glory that no civilization had ever reached. It would conquer the known world, build roads and aqueducts and cities that would last for millennia, and create a legacy that would shape human history for 2,000 years. But it would also plant the seeds of Rome's own destruction, because a nation that will sacrifice everything to win will eventually have nothing left to sacrifice. And when that day comes, the empire will collapse under the weight of its own ambition. The First Punic War was over. Rome had won. But the cost of that victory would echo through the centuries, a reminder that every triumph carries within it the seeds of tragedy. The sea, indifferent and eternal, continued to roll against the shore, and somewhere in the depths, the ghosts of 100,000 sailors drifted in the darkness, their names forgotten, their sacrifices remembered only by the waves. Rome had learned to sail, it had learned to fight, and it had learned that victory, no matter how glorious, always comes with a price. The Republic would endure, but it would never be the same. The end.